All right. So, so your answers that I've seen, I've gone through, I admit, like I just scanned some quizzes and I find it disappointing that you chose literally the easiest way to answer the question, um, which kind of, I understand because at the end of the day, you're freshmen and you're still carrying all this school-based knowledge, which is basically easy little nuggets of information that you can simply place into brackets and get at least a mark, if not more. But I need you to remember this, that I have literally seen answers to the questions that are like two sentences. You will probably not do super well if that's the basic level that you've written at. So going forward, please do remember that complexity and challenge and quality of thought, even if the question is simple, is required of you. And it's possible that our next quiz will not be in short answer format. And instead of that, I might give you scenario-based multiple choice questions, which are harder because there is no right answer. You just have to find the best possible answer. And I think that perhaps that's a better way to test you. These are my thoughts on the quiz, and by all means, please share your own. Um, because, like I said, I was quite conscious of how simplistic it was, but I was also a little disappointed in how most people did not make the effort, even, to think. Um, So I'm just wondering what you think about what I'm saying to you right now, or what your experience was taking the quiz, because it was online. You did have to type. I know some students have issues with typing, which is okay. So yeah, your thoughts, and then we'll begin. Okay. Thank you. That is helpful. Vanya, go ahead.
Yeah, so I feel like, okay, so like the quiz was online, and since we've
Sorry,
had like
somebody
most of
online
our,
wants to speak.
can you hear me?
Vanya, if you can hear me, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so basically
Are
like
you in
with
class or online? I'm confused.
I'm online.
Cannot hear you, Frank. Sorry.
Can you hear me
Um,
now?
I'm not sure why. Y'all don't, please don't break this classroom. I think it's a bit, there's a what? Well, maybe we open a door so there's light and the poor cat can stop panicking and live a happy, non-traumatized life. There's a cat inside the room. Is there a way to leave this door open? Oh, little cat. She wants to teach you today. Can I grab I have five. Yeah, and a dog. Um, Sorry, we had a cat emergency. Um, just wait. Thank you. Okay. So now that I have griped and whined about the quiz, which by the way, please don't be super hard on yourself. I am hard on freshmen. I think some of you are honestly much better students at freshman level than I ever was. I was awful. But again, that doesn't mean I can't expect better from you, which I always will, because I think that you are all capable of a lot more than I'm seeing at present time in your quizzes. Because when I think about the quality of class participation that I have received from this course, and this is like a little bit of appreciation that I think I should give you, and it's important for me to tell you this, the quality of your class participation has become actually generally very, very good, right? So I'm reading these emails, and obviously Safa and Fatma respond to you, but it's really cool to see how many of you are starting to really start applying what you're reading, what you're understanding, coming up with deeper, more complex questions, instead of, basic, like, what is the meaning of this type, which is just like, okay, buddy, Google it, right? So this is great, and I think it's promising. And so I think maybe that is why when I saw the responses to the quiz, I was a bit disappointed, because I was like, either they're having somebody else write their class participation for them, or like, I don't know, it was weird to me. It was just, uh, it caused some cognitive dissonance, which you'll also learn about as we go on. So now today's class, and I'm gonna not use a presentation at all. I will upload a presentation for you so that you can look at it. Now all you have is my face and my voice if you're online. Good for you not waking up. And second, please feel free, if you're in this room, to talk at any time. If you're online, I do apologize, but I don't know if I can, because I can't hear you. I don't know what the deal is. The speaker is working on this laptop, but I think it's connected to the auditorium speakers, which don't have power, so I can't hear you. So if you type something in the chat, I will absolutely look at it, but please remember, if you're online, you are completely muted right now to me. I can't hear anything. So today we're supposed to start developmental psychology. And this is also the area that I myself have specialized in. So my knowledge of this is much, much deeper and far more complex than my knowledge or understanding of some of the other things we've studied, which is evolutionary psychology or behavior genetics. Those are not my areas of specialization. But since this is, feel free to ask me whatever you want, and I should probably be able to answer right on point today. So that's there. The question becomes, what is developmental psychology, right? And so far we know that psychology is, yes, okay, we know it's a study of behavior, it's a study of the mind. When you add the word developmental to that, what does it tell you? What do you think developmental psychology? How human beings change over the course of time. Or how do we develop over time? Okay, but that would also include biological or physiological aspects, right? Like height and weight, correct? So again, psychology is a science of mind and behavior, right? Add development to it, what do you get? Exactly. How does our mind and our behavior develop over the human lifespan, and what are some of the common changes that you can see happening within people, regardless, irrespective of race or gender? What are some of the similarities between the development of particular genders? What are some of the differences in that developmental trajectory? Are those differences actual differences, or are they created differences, which implies the psychosocial levels of analysis are used to understand that. And the purpose of studying human development for me, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't see this. I'm going to read to you guys some of the chat. So how and why people change in time, development of mind, how our mind adapts to change with time. Can you remember this thought? How our mind adapts to change with time. That's good. how and why people change in time, how psychology is developed over a science over time as society and individuals have changed. No. Changes in the behavior and mind, sort of, yes, developmental changes, which implies that there is a movement, right? That's what you need to remember. There's a movement, there's a shift. We are constantly growing, changing. Parts of us decline, fall out of use, parts of us form, are put into use, so on, so forth. Over the human lifespan, that's what happens to our bodies. It's also what happens to our minds. It's also, in turn, therefore, what happens to our behaviors. Okay? And the reason we want to ask these questions, what is the point, right? What is the point of studying human development, psychologically speaking? Why do we need to understand how people change? Why is it so important? Or why people change? Why do we want to understand the whys and the hows? Yes.
Because, as we know, there's some psychological diseases that develop through time, statistically out that there is a gene that's there, but it develops in late 20s. And there are other things like when a person can go mad with LV state, and they can just lose it, or go into depression. Depression develops over time. If we understand, how these changes come to be, we can, start maybe diagnosing them early on, or maybe developing treatments or better cures for them.
That's very good. Yeah. Sorry, continue.
To sum up what he said, to optimize development. So when we understand how we develop, so we can, tailor it or to optimize our development in a sense.
Okay. So also online, to understand why people in the past or people from a certain context behave or think in a certain way. So absolutely, what are the forces influencing that developmental trajectory, right? What's acting on your mind and in turn your behavior? With this example of psychological disorders I was just given in class, I'm going to share it with you guys online, is a very, very good example. So if we think about there's one psychological disorder you may be familiar with. It's called schizophrenia. When you are suffering from schizophrenia, your cognitive abilities, particularly your visual and auditory perception, becomes maladaptive. Your worldview becomes maladaptive, okay? And by maladaptive, I want you to remember that constantly from the beginning of this class, we've been talking about human beings and the human mind being highly adaptive, which is what enables us to deal with our environment in order to survive. Okay? But when schizophrenia, for instance, is when a psychological disorder, not disease, like schizophrenia is diagnosed, there's an alteration in the perception of reality, which is contributed to by auditory delusions or hallucinations, which are visual, again, distortions in your perceptual abilities. But developmental psychology, if you link that to this, what you understand is, number one, schizophrenia tends to emerge by late adolescence, most commonly. Number two, the earlier you are able to identify somebody who has maybe developed or is developing schizophrenia, the better you are able to help them. Which brings me to tie it all together to what you were saying about we need to study human development to optimize that development. Now, you cannot optimize something without understanding what can possibly optimize that development, and two, how to get rid of roadblocks in that development. How do you deal with challenges or threats to that development, okay? Now, this is a very wide, broad picture. But when you narrow it down, what you find is that there are applications of this to a bunch of different fields. Okay, can you think of one? One person has said environmental and situational factors that stun or promote development of sorts. That's absolutely what I was getting at when I was talking about challenges to development or potential protective factors to human development. And right now, every time I say human development or development, need you to remember we're talking about psychological development, okay? So again, my question becomes, think about one thing that is an application of developmental psychology in education. How would an educator use developmental psychology, or why should an educator use developmental psychology?
So, if there are certain methods which will make like learning easier or something that's going to make it more streamlined for us to understand, that's a better way to developmental psychology would help in that. For example, like exercise.
Sorry.
Exercise.
Mic chala de. I'm listening. Exercise.
For example, learning techniques so that developmental psychology can have.
Thank you. I'm listening. Learning techniques.
Yes, learning techniques and exercise that's the developmental psychology, like how can we aid learning?
How can we aid learning? Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that you might understand as an application of developmental psychology is, like we already said, the treatment of mental illness or diagnosing mental illness. The second thing could be within the space of education, but there's also an interlap, right? Or an overlap rather between diagnosing a psychological disorder and being a good educator. You have to have an understanding of this to be able to do that. And this meaning psychological disorders such as students who have learning disabilities. As an educator, is very important for us to understand that. But to understand where learning disabilities come from or how autism emerges in students, you have to also understand the developmental trajectory, right? And so what I'll do is, without further ado, ooh, it's quite loud. You can hear me? Do I need this? Yeah? Why didn't you say anything for like the 20 minutes that I've been yapping? Oh, now you can. Oh, now you can't. Okay. Okay, I'll use this. Sorry, just. This is not an optimal stage of my own development. Can I please just share that? Okay. So you can see, perfect. So we've harped on and on about why it's so important to understand developmental psychology, which is pretty much my life's purpose as well. But a couple of now technicalities. When, as psychologists, we approach this question of how does the mind and the behavior develop, we have to remember, and this relates to what was said right at the beginning when I said, what does developmental psychology mean? And somebody talked about something, and I said, no, you're not just talking about changes in the body, right? And so this is what that means. We are looking at the development of personality. We're looking at the development of cognition. We're looking at the development of your social skills and interactions and relationships. And part of that is physical development. Why? Why is physical development of the body important for us to consider, even though our focus is on the evolution of the changes in the mind and body over the human life, mind and behavior over the human lifespan? Why do we need to incorporate the physical body? Yes. Absolutely. So this is a very excellent answer. In a nutshell, the brain's functionality has a direct impact on your cognition, on your thought, on your thinking, as well as your body. Sorry, no. You say it again. You said it so well. Yes, thank you. So brain functionality has a huge impact on the way the body grows. At the same time, we also know that the way that your body looks also has an influence on your cognition. When we talk about constructs like self-esteem or self-concept, we often talk about body image. That's a very small, very zeroed in example. of what that relationship looks like, right? The relationship between your mind and your physical brain and your physical body is so interlinked, it's so complex that you cannot just isolate. You've got to study the relationships between them. Now, there are three major things about developmental psychology that you need to know. Number one, within the approaches to human development, again, I'll remind you, I'm talking about psychological development here. Amongst those approaches to human development, there is, number one, this perspective of does this development happen in the form of going from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 to level 4, almost like climbing a staircase, if you can imagine that, right? So you can't get to the top stair without crossing the bottom stair. So you can't go to stage 5 of development without going through stage 1, 2, 3, 4. On the flip side, there is an approach that says that no, you can't do this. What you can say is that at age 0, assume person has skill A. Okay? Skill A, by the time the person becomes 10 years old, will have become a very complex ability. But it doesn't develop in these stages. Okay? There's no jump. You already have this ability. It just becomes more and more complex, right? So they only look at, in a non-stage-based theory, which we refer to as a theory of continuous development, they only look at qualitative changes in characteristics over time. They do not assume that you acquire a new skill, a new cognitive ability every time it's been like 2 or 3 years, right? So on the one side, stage-based approaches to human development assume that at different stages, entirely new and fresh abilities are added to our cognitive repertoire, whereas on the other hand, non-stage-based theories assume that whatever we have at birth just becomes more and more and more complex as you go on. If you are interested, this dates all the way back to early philosophy as well, where I think it was John Locke or John Stuart Mill, one of the Johns, who said something about the mind being a blank slate. Okay? Whereas I think it was Aristotle who said the mind develops through dialogue. Right? So this particular view, you can also trace it all the way back to those sorts of philosophical schools of thought. The second thing that we talk about is stability versus change, which is very important, because when we talk about stability versus change, what we're referring to is that, okay, how much of what you have remains static and doesn't change? How much of who you are is just who you are and is not going to change, as opposed to this other perspective that says that we do continue to change constantly, and it's never, the human being is never not in a state of flux. Yes? Repeat? Excellent, very good. I hope you did well on your quiz. This example of an unchanging trait, which is not a trait, but it is a characteristic that has been provided, which is fantastic, is temperament. You have it at birth, it's genetic, it's a genetic component of your personality. And in fact, when we were studying temperament, I remember a large number of you asked, okay, does the temperament change or not? Okay? And what we understand of the temperament is that it does remain relatively stable, which means it doesn't change, right? Some of you had asked about personality, and I told you that after you hit 40, your personality pretty much doesn't change. It becomes stable. You understand? So don't think of stability and change or stages and transitions as approaches that have to be taken just as they are. Right? Don't take them at surface value. It's not black and white. Because at the end of the day, 25, 30 years ago, we thought that at the age of 18, everything is done and you don't really change after that, right? 25 years later, we now understand that no, everything continues to change for a certain amount of time, and there are other things that continue to change over your lifespan. For example, your memory, right? If the brain is adaptive and enables us to deal with changing environments, then that also implies that the brain does have certain some degeneration in your neural networks that takes place, and some of that is just not preventable. Just like, let's say right now, if I asked you to run 2 kilometers, you would be able to do it. Even if you're not a runner, even if you don't like exercise, you will still be able to do it. Can I ask the average 90-year-old to run 2 kilometers? No, right? No matter how fit this person has been, no matter how healthy their life has been, a certain degree of that degeneration is just aging. So we have to account for that as we understand human development. And actually, understanding the processes of aging is very important. And a lot, in fact, almost all our theories do touch upon what happens to us as we age. Okay. The last one, I'm not going to go into, but yes.
So the development psychologists who believe in stability believe that the brain is not plastic because the capacity and the ability of brain to change is called plasticity. Brain adapts called plasticity, right? So the development psychologists who believe in stability part, do they believe that the brain is not plastic and it is as it is as?
They believe, they believe that there are more parts of us that remain unchanging. It's not, this is what I meant when I said don't look at them as one size fits all, right? Because just like I said, right now you can run, at 90 you can't, right? So वो चीज आपकी change हो रही है, but at the same time, perhaps right now if I asked you to write something, and I asked you to write something at 90, you could still do it, right? Perhaps a little slower, but you still have that ability, right? So think about it from that lens when we talk about cognitive abilities as well. Now, nature versus nurture, we have talked this to death, but again, in developmental psychology, you want to understand how the relationship between genetics and environment influences the development of a person's cognition, of a person's social interactions and relationships, a theory of mind, which is a specific piece of cognition responsible for your capacity for social interaction, and so on and so forth. And so behavioral genetics is part and parcel of developmental psychology. But just like with everything, think about biopsychosocial approach. The biopsychosocial approach to understanding human development. Now we're just going to get on with this. Okay. So some of the key approaches that you're going to study in developmental psychology are Jean Piaget's approach, Erik Erikson's approach, Lawrence Kohlberg's approach. You're also going to study Vygotsky's approach. We'll also discuss the ways in which our earliest emotional bonds continue to influence our behavior and our personality as we age. We're also going to talk a little bit, just a little bit, about the development of morality as understood by Piaget, which I personally think is a really, really interesting approach, although right now empirical evidence for it, I would say that there needs to be more. Okay, but it's a really, really interesting approach to the development of morality, which is such a gray area, right? Now, remember I told you about stage-based approaches. Much like a video game, you go from level 1, level 2, level 3, and each level brings increasing complexity and new things, right? When you play a video game, your character at every stage evolves a little bit, right? I don't play video games, so I can't think of any examples, but like, it's like, yeah. Somebody who plays video games want to give me an example, rescue me here. Like, you know, when your character becomes a new type of like elevated. Huh?
After you get a level, you gain XP and you can, level up. And obviously, you get your armor as well. Most of the concept of the sword, you get more armor, you get more weapons, more experience, more things over.
So you can collect experience points, and as you go from one level to the other, the experience points you've collected allow you to acquire something new. Maybe let's just think about it like that. Safa, I don't know if you're here, but there are people in the waiting room. Okay, just gonna go to chat. It's an upgrade to your game character as one plays more. Yes, okay, fine, okay. So you kind of become an upgraded version of yourself as you move through each stage. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so what happens is, for example, I'm going to take one ability. Okay. The ability to know that I've shown you this, and now you can't see it anymore. That doesn't mean that this doesn't exist anymore, right? It's like the most important sort of foundational thing that we have to have in order for us to be able to, let's say, do math, in order for us to be able to remember who our family and friends are, in order for us to not have a complete nervous breakdown every morning when we wake up because we don't know where we are, because like, I don't remember being in this room. Oh my God, I don't remember, do I have a bathroom? I've never seen it before. Do you know what? That is such a fundamental skill, right? It's called object permanence, and we'll talk about it. But without object permanence, assume this, level 1, without object permanence, you can't go to level 2, which is the point at which, well, Piaget would say, you are able to quite literally put 2 and 2 together. Yes. And without being able to put 2 and 2 together, you will never understand how to say that 4 multiplied by 4 is 16. But without knowing that 4 multiplied by 4 is 16, you can never ask the question, what happens if I want to half 16 divided by 10 multiplied by 100 and calculate the distance over time, speed. Sorry, really shouldn't go with a math analogy. But you get what I'm saying, right? Without knowing, better example, without knowing that 4 into 4 is 16, you will not be able to solve the most basic Pythagoras theorem. You will not be able to apply it. That's the only thing that I remember from O-level math, the Pythagoras theorem. Okay, so yes.
So already if you not know the aspects of the English language, we won't be able to form words or write words or make sentences.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's much like your understanding of language also. As you grow older, you're able to not just think more complex thoughts, you're able to articulate more complex thoughts. But remember, we're talking about stage-based approaches, right? So without level 1, you can't go to level 2. Without level 2, you can't go to level 3, and so on and so forth. So for example, Erik Erikson would say that every human being goes through a particular sort of series of stages to develop who they are, or their sense of identity changes according to these set in stone stages, and at each stage there is a conflict. The resolution of that conflict can only happen in one of the 2 ways, and that then sets the tone for the next stage, and then that resolution then sets the tone for the next stage, and so on and so forth. So again, you can't do level 2 without level 1. You can't do level 5 without level 4, right? There are no shortcuts in this stage-based model, and that is why we call it a discontinuous one. Stage-based theories are referred to as discontinuous approaches to human development because they assume these jumps to happen. Okay? On the flip side, a qualitative approach like Lev Vygotsky's approach to cognitive development, which we'll also study, is a transition or continuous theory of development whereby we just become qualitatively better over time. Stage-based theorists, please do remember, don't get confused. Stage-based theorists are also talking about qualitative change. Okay? But the qualitative change that they're looking at is confined to particular stages. It is not a continuous qualitative change that they look at. So don't let this confuse you. It can get confusing, but remember this. And when we are talking about, when I'm using the word qualitative, I'm talking about characteristics that change, right? In their complexity, in their depth, in their practice, in their application. Yes, your question.
I think what you said kind of answered my question, but I think you would further clarify it. When we're talking about getting qualitatively better, isn't it true that there are some characteristics or traits that we have that are better at our childhood or at an initial level, and then over time they do degenerate, as we say, or our capacity for them isn't as great. So, for example, our ability to memorize or learn at a younger age is we have a much higher capability to do that than when we get older.
Is that actually true though?
Yes.
Is that actually true?
I mean,
You can't see it, I'm smiling behind my two masks. I'm smiling behind my two masks, you can't see it. No.
majority of research would suggest that that is exactly what happens.
So it's not impossible, you're right, it does become harder. And I want you to hold that in mind as we talk about the development of your neural networks, okay? Because that will answer this question of why does it become harder, right? Because logically, and this is something that used to interest me when I was starting out, when I was studying developmental psychology, is that logically speaking, if my brain is adaptive and it's helping me survive, right, then the more I grow and the more adaptive my brain becomes, right, because my brain is plastic, it's going to help me survive, whatever. Why is it that as I get older, I notice in myself as well certain changes, right? Like it is a little bit slower for me to use Microsoft Word, just a little bit, right? But there is a shift. I can sense that shift, right? Because assuming that even just, let's say 5 years ago, if I needed to write a paper, I could basically write it in 3 hours, max, right? 15 to 20 years ago, I was able to write a research paper, 2,500 words in 3 hours. Today, I can't. I actually can't. I need to have a couple of days at most, right? At least, sorry. So I have also been saying, when my brain is becoming adaptive, when I'm learning more, I'm smarter today than I was 20 years ago, why have I slowed down? Right? Even as I push myself to do all the things that, they tell you, have flax seed and have chia seed and drink orange juice and exercise and mindfulness and meditation, and I do everything. So why is it still happening? Number one, aging. Number two, neural networks, related, completely related concepts. Which brings me, I think I should just go to the next piece of this. I think I've kind of just talked to you already about this, that your temperament, somebody said this brilliant thing about temperament not changing. Temperament doesn't change, personality traits do. We've already talked about this, it's fine. Forget this. Right, this is important. When you are a baby, okay, like not a born baby, which is what we call prenatal stage. You are in the womb, and at that level, you have at that level, you have just cells. You are just cells, right? But if by 3 to 8 weeks, you are able to show a brain, what does that mean about your ability for thought at 3 to 8 weeks? And by thought, I just mean cognition. Online humans. You guys can, by the way, unmute and talk now because I think the speakers are connected. So go for it if you need. Aisha, go ahead. Try to unmute yourself and then speak.
Okay, can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay, so basically I had a question that like when we were kids, so we were less tolerant towards, adults' behavior and attitude. We didn't like, and we always thought that we are not going to be like any of the typical adults, right? But as we grow up, we are more tolerant towards, the behaviors of adults, and with time we ourselves adapt similar changes and become a typical adult ourselves, that boring person. So is it because when we grow our tolerance increases, or is it because of the societal pressure that we are forced to behave in that particular way? Because when we are kids, we are really rebellious and we don't want to listen to anybody.
Okay, you're talking about obedience, if I'm not mistaken. That's what your question is, that what makes us more obedient as we grow older. Correct?
Yes.
The thing I will say to you is that not all of us become more obedient as we grow older. Right? It's not a fact of life for all of us.
I'm not particularly talking about obedience, but the characteristics and the traits that normal adults have. They're more boring and they don't really want to, socialize, and they have their set of activities. But when we were kids, like we really used to hate it, and we used to think that we are not going to be like any of the typical adults. ठीक है? But जब हम grow करते हैं, तो we become like them. We become one of them, right? इज इट बिकॉज कि हमारा टॉलरेंस इंक्रीज होता है, या हमारे सोसाइटल प्रेशर की वजह से हम उस तरह से हमारा माइंड जो है वो डेवलप हो जाता है?
Okay, I get it, I think, a little bit. Your boringness or lack thereof is not a factor of age or human development, okay? It's too subjective. What you think is boring may not be to somebody else. Now, if instead of that, we were to talk about perhaps, and the reason I'm telling you that what you think is boring may not be the same for someone else is because I'm pointing out that your question is based on something that is a subjectivity. It is a preference. It is a taste, right? If I went bungee jumping 10 years ago, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't do it again, right? Even if I was 40, I actually know somebody who's my friend's mother who jumped 350 feet, I think it's, or 300 feet. It's the highest bungee jump in the world. It's somewhere in Australia. This lady, and this is my friend's mother. I'm old. So she did this jump when we were 25. She was at least 55, right? So preference. If I asked my mother, do you want to bungee jump? I don't even want to have that conversation, okay? But, so again, I'm just telling you that you're asking me about a preference, and preferences are the most sort of unstable thing, right? Your preferences can absolutely change over time, okay? It's like when you were little, you liked to eat some weird candy that you got from the corner shop. I promise you, if you ate it today, you probably still like it, you're young enough. In 10 years, if you ate it, you'll be like, Some of you will be like, this is just as great as I remember it, while others will be like, I can't believe I put this into my body, right? So So again, it's preference, it shifts, it changes, it's so subjective. So I hope that answers your question, and I hope I understood your question correctly. And if I didn't, please feel free to email me and shout at me about it. I need to move on.
Ma'am, I have one question.
Huh?
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, what's your name?
Rifatullah.
Okay, go ahead, Rifadullah.
Ma'am, actually, once we got birth, I mean after birth, we show that that characters which came from our genes, and after that, by judging the surrounding or getting something from the surrounding, we just change.
Rifadullah, can you be loud? Because I can't hear you. Sorry, just be really loud.
Ma'am, I want to say that after birth, we are showing the characteristic or habits which comes from our genes. But as we grew older, the surrounding affect us, and we do so. Maybe that are bad or good.
Uh, okay, I couldn't hear you perfectly, but were you saying that your genes are related to your development? Did somebody hear him correctly? I'm really sorry. We can't clearly hear you. You have to be louder.
Yes, I think he's talking about the development of morality over time.
I can't hear you either. You guys have to be louder. What? Who is talking about that?
I think like Griffithula was talking about how the development of morality over time, sort of like so innate like abilities and development sort of it's like different from each other. So something like that.
Okay. Okay, I feel like I've become also one of the other sad things about growing old is I'm losing hearing in 1 year. I'm not making this up. So please just, I beg of you, treat me like a geriatric and be really loud whenever you talk because it's hard. It's hard for me to hear from 1 year. So yeah, thank you. Rifadullah, I think your question about, if I'm not mistaken, as Vanya has kindly explained, is that it was about the development of morality over time, that once you're born, is morality genetically hardwired into you, or is it something you learn and acquire from the adults in your life? Was that your question? Raise hand if yes, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I heard that. Okay, cool. So when I want you to hold on to this question, when we talk about a couple of theories of moral development, one is Piaget's, where we talk about intellectual autonomy and intellectual heteronomy and moral autonomy and moral heteronomy, and I'll tell you what that means. But also we will be talking about Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development, where interestingly he says that when we're born, when we're really little, our understanding of the world is that there is an external authority who is going to tell us what is good and what is bad, and we will follow that external authority. But imagine this, that by the time you're in your 60s, Kohlberg says that you acquire this sort of sense of universal justice. And you may actually acquire this sense of universal principles of morality, or you can think about the world as a broader sort of, you kind of get involved in considering the gray areas of morality. You can say something, for instance, like, if you tell a young person that this person hit you and you should not hit them, it's really hard for a younger person to understand that. But somebody who's considering the universal principles of justice and social justice might think that no, actually, if this person hit me, what's happening in their life? There must be something happening. I probably triggered some response. I should speak to this person. I should see what the problem is. Perhaps it's because I am so privileged and this person is not. So I am just kind of, I've maybe inadvertently bullied this person into this response. I need to think about it before I can go ahead and whack them, right? So it stops being this eye for an eye model as you become that age, as you grow older. So that's my response. Now I want to come back to prenatal development, please. So like I said, if you have this brain within you at that prenatal stage. And you can see, I thought this was a really, really easy way to show you how the size of the brain also grows before you're even born, right? The reason this is important is because that's your baseline for future development, okay? So you see here forebrain, hindbrain, and midbrain. This forebrain is also where your frontal lobe is. The frontal lobe is, I've told you, I think before also, one of the older brain structures, and it is one of the most important ones. All of them are important, but the frontal lobe is very important because you know how we say that somebody becomes an adult when they can think logically and they can think rationally. The frontal lobe is that part of your brain. It's responsible for judging, for planning, for rational thought. And you already have that baseline when you are born because that baseline has started to develop in you at this prenatal stage. Okay? As you become older, the frontal lobe continues to develop. It continues to grow. It continues to expand. It actually grows bigger, larger in size. The evidence that we have that this brain you see here is not just a physical structure. The evidence we have that this is a working brain, maybe at a basic level, but it's working, is found in the fact that once children are born, infants, newborns, they will turn and respond to the sound of their mother's voice. That tells us that this brain, this underdeveloped brain, absolutely, is still processing auditory information that it has received from within the womb. There is still some basic strain of memory there, right? That's why you need to understand that we have this with us at birth. And this makes the debate about development a little bit more complex because it's like, wait, if we're born with this brain and we know, for instance, that we have this capacity to remember our mother's voice in the womb or we respond to it, and actually it's more than voice, right? It's language. So I'll give you an example. I have a friend who just had a baby and he's Pathan and his wife is Italian, okay? Now, the baby was born about 4 to 6 months ago and I'll call it it. So it, right at birth, did not respond to its father's side of the family. Okay? Because they were just talking in English and they were talking in Pashto. However, every time Italian was spoken or is spoken still around that kid, but this is important for that infancy stage, that child looked to see where is the sound coming from, right? So something to kind of think about, because that also implies, right, that you can have this capacity for selective attention, which is a pretty complex cognitive ability. Selective attention helps us survive. So, you know, that's what I meant, like it becomes confusing even when I grapple with these questions, when I think about development and developmental psychology, it's like, but we have these things. So why are there people saying that we have nothing and then everything is born, like acquired as you grow older, but like, if we didn't have these things in our brain, if our brain didn't exist, then would we ever be able to do anything at all? Essentially, kind of like, I think one of my largest questions is, and it's a very big question, I'll share it with you because it keeps me up at night sometimes, is that is like all these stages and these transitions and all these theoretical frameworks, are we just trying to articulate foregone conclusions? Do you understand what a foregone conclusion is? When we're trying to explain human development, are we just saying things that have already been said, that are straightforward, that are obvious, and that are true, and that are guaranteed? So is there even a point? Okay, and maybe that's something that's a much larger question that maybe only I should keep to myself next time, but something to think about. All right, so second, do you remember when we did epigenetics and we were talking about genetic markers that can be introduced? And if you recall, we had that specific conversation about the diagram I showed you, which had a mother who was engaged in substance abuse during the prenatal stage that resulted in an epigenetic change in the child. But at the same time, that what that diagram covered was, yes, absolutely, the prenatal stage has this influence on your genetics, but also at that prenatal stage, if you are not getting adequate nutrition, or if you are not getting adequate, or if you are, instead of nutrition, getting exposed to toxic substances like nicotine or alcohol, it affects your brain development, right? And so your chances at birth of complexity or of the abilities we assume children to have at birth, right? Those are impacted. So perhaps a child who's been exposed to substance abuse at the prenatal stage may not actually respond as quickly and as rapidly and with so much attention as my friend's baby did to his mother's voice speaking Italian. You get it? So the brain is very sensitive. Even right now, as you're in this classroom, as for example, I'm trying to teach you and listen to you and listen to you and listen to my voice and read the slide and try to not ignore the chat. It's like my brain is like firing off like 1,000,000 miles per hour, right? Which is great. It's like exercise. At my age, I need it. But it's wonderful. Right? I can never stop getting excited about the brain. I mean, wow. I was watching this stupid video yesterday, which was about, it was something about the unconscious. And I think just the word unconscious bothers me. And a lot of you have given Freudian examples on chat, not you guys. But I mean, I think the unconscious is literally a trigger for me. Sharik, you were saying something online. Can you go ahead?
I just wanted to ask, why is it important to study?
You have a deaf speaker, louder.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I wanted to ask, why is it important to study the innate personality or the personality a child is born with, when eventually the behaviors of the personality the child is going to show in their adulthood is going to be learned anyways?
I need you to repeat the last two sentences, please.
Okay, basically, you know how the therapy CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, argues that a person's behavior and cognition can be changed and that behavior is basically learned, then why is it important to study a child's innate personality when it is going to change anyways later on?
Oh, why is it important to study these things if they're anyway going to change later on? And by things, you're referring to behavior and mind, right?
Yes.
It's important to study these things because then you know how to deal with children. Then you know how to facilitate the development of their behavior and their mind in a positive way. Okay. So, a couple more things about development, just important concepts that stand out. One is habituation. This is not the same thing as desensitization. What do you understand desensitization to be? When something stops acting as a stimuli. Doesn't elicit a response anymore. That's desensitization. Okay. What's that then? I'm smiling under my mask. You see this on the board, right? Habituation, decline in responsiveness once they have become desensitized, i.e. repetitively exposed to it. Two related but different concepts. Okay. Habits are things that, or let's say, if I say to you that I have, okay, wait, when we stop responding to when we just stop responding to particular stimuli. So when we talk about habituation, number one, we're talking about infants. Okay? Number two, this is again, remember, baseline. It's your perception in development. Habituation, the best example that I can give you is every newborn baby, you show them keys or you show them something shiny, they will become obsessed with it and they'll want to keep looking at it. But hey, you go visit your friend's children 4 months later and you're like, hey, look at my keys. And they're like, who are you? What do you want? Right? It's not interesting anymore. They became habituated. They were exposed to that initially novel stimuli repeatedly. And so they no longer have a response to it. They have become habituated to it. It is just part of the environment. This is why newborns spend a lot of time staring at the ceiling fan, but eventually stop and don't care. And you'll be like a new parent and you'll be like, look, my child is obsessed with the fan, and the child is like, what fan, right? So this is how it works. You, and also I think next to you, can you guys tell me your names? I feel bad saying you and you and you. Sadaf and Mohammed Ali. So Ali first, because you had your hand raised earlier, and I.
I don't actually what language I don't know which legend, but some king, I think in conscious culture, had this experiment to find out what the natural or the actual language we are. So what he did was he isolated a couple of people into a room and ordered the nobody would speak a word to them, and they would like if they don't learn the language from the standard source, they will speak a language that is actually natural.
Okay.
So when they were isolated into the room, it took most of the children were, they did not have any language development. They were that but there was this child inside some word which was translated into bread in some language, and then the king declared that language as the national language. But it was later realized the mother, when the child was in the womb of the mother, and the mother had this kunki is one, so that is why the child was also able to conquer this word. That also maybe tells us, even in the previous stages, the child is able to pick up from that.
Yes, except it's a beautiful story, right? It's a very good story, and I need you to remember it when we start talking about universal grammar, which will happen when we study language development, which will happen later on in the course. So, are you very excited about universal grammar? Yes. Yes. We'll study some Chomsky as well. So remember this, and you want to, if you're interested in this, read some Noam Chomsky. Okay? Yes.
I think it could also repeat what he was saying, that isn't this our ability, like the initial stages to language and everything, it's not an actual conscious cognitive ability that we are exercising, right? I think it could be argued that it's more like a survival instinct in a way that humans have developed. Like for example, even this definite sense of their other smells, that's not something that's only for humans. Even other animals also have that. So, and also even pertaining to memory and everything, we do not actually remember anything. I think till the age of 2, I think it's called childhood amnesia or something. But it's not an explicit or implicit memory.
Yeah. No. We don't know enough to say conclusively that childhood amnesia is real. We do explain it, and we do have evidence for it, simply because the studies of childhood memory or children and their memory forming networks has shown that those networks, what happens over time is that as you grow older, unused neural pathways are gotten rid of. This is a process that our brain automatically does.
Even this happens generally, like our
Exactly, exactly. It's called pruning. Okay. So by way of pruning, some of those neural networks are just done away with so that you can form new neural connections. Second, because you don't refer to them, it takes a really long time to remember them. But this does not mean that in childhood आपकी memories form नहीं हो रही. That's my point. Okay? Yes.
Whatever I'm say, it will be, I think, in contradiction with the environment. That in the light of this development technology, our study parents focus to the children to be morally ethical, to be just towards life. So we do see our society different towards people to corruption. So is it innate or inherent characteristics, or this kind of regress is nature in humans to do corruption?
I can't give you an honest, like, complete answer to this, but refer back to the ultimatum game. What is fair looks different in different contexts, right? If you remember the ultimatum game that we studied, the experiment that was done on the distribution of X amount of money, where you could keep some money and give some proportion, whatever. Refer back to that experiment because it will show you that what fairness looks like is a norm, and it is a norm that looks different in an individualistic society as opposed to a collective society, collectivist society. At the same time, it's also important to think about this. And the reason I'm telling you this is because, look, what you are calling corruption, is it corruption or is it a means of survival? Right? It can't. Child is hungry and steals an apple. Do you cut the child's hands off or do you give the kid some food? So you cannot reduce it down. I can't say that, oh yeah, we are like corrupt as a society because we are born to be corrupt and we are taught to be corrupt. I can't conclusively say that because we live in a developing country where there are so many constraints on us that our environment places that we sometimes have no choice but to break the rules, right? So if you are born and bred in Karachi, you will understand that after midnight or maybe even before midnight, if you are at a deserted traffic light, the last thing you should do is stop for the red light. It's breaking a rule, but for what purpose? Self-preservation. So again, think very long and hard about your own question. Break it down. No, wait. We are really over time. We will stop now. Thank you for your patience over the disastrous first half an hour of this class, which I am not responsible for, but apologizing for. Yes? Who? Predilection means a predisposition, a preference. Okay? Okay. Online folks, I'm sorry, I know you've been mostly kind of not as involved as usual, but that's okay. Next Monday, I want to say this once and then you guys can go. Next Monday, we are not doing this in person. Okay, we are doing this online, and I refuse to do this in person again until I can have at least 40 people in this room. So you all have a group, you all do your lobby. I don't mind, okay? I don't mind coming to teach even just 10 of you if you guys say to me that I really cannot just learn online, but do recognize that catering to you guys on the screen and catering to you guys in person is a challenge. And if there are more of you here and here, it becomes an equal balance. If there's less of you, it becomes harder for me. Okay, and then the people online will suffer, the people in person will suffer, and I just don't want anybody to have to suffer. So maybe you could come to some consensus. I am happy to come in the morning just I don't want to be here just because you wanted to come to campus. Okay? Think about your learning, please. Because you know, it's not a normal situation, and it is a health risk. So I would rather be careful and cautious and not compromise on the quality of delivery, which I think you guys online today, and I'm really sorry you suffered a lot. I'll do better by you next time. So thank you. Bye bye. Monday we do online, and then you guys convince me to come back in person. Bye bye. Bye online kids. Thank you for your patience. Bye.